Joseph Jugashvili called himself Stalin, which meant man of steel. His actions more than lived up to his name. Stalin's single-mindedness drove the Soviet Union to become an industrial power in just 10 short years. But this same mindset also led to merciless brutality. During Stalin's rule, tens of millions of people were tortured, executed, or lived a life of incredible suffering. For many Russians, life under Stalin was a life of terror. Under Lenin's lead, the Russian people were freed from an oppressive Tsarist regime and promised a golden future of communism. With his death in 1924, the country was plunged into deep despair. But two successors waited eagerly on the sidelines: Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky. Both men were members of the Politburo, which controlled the Communist Party. But their ideologies differed greatly, and they had a deep hatred of each other. Trotsky was considered the person most likely to succeed Lenin. He was the party's intellectual and a military hero of the Civil War. But while he was a strong leader, Trotsky's arrogance isolated him. Over time, Stalin proved himself the superior politician. From his position as general secretary, he stacked the party with supporters. He then teamed up with two other Politburo members, Kamenev and Zinoviev, and the three dedicated themselves to discrediting Trotsky. Their campaign worked, and Trotsky became more unpopular. In January 1925, Stalin forced his resignation from the position of Commissar of War. Although he regained his Politburo membership, Trotsky had lost most of his power and influence. Once rid of Trotsky, Stalin consolidated his power base. One by one, he went through the party, expelling all his opponents. At the 1927 Party Congress, Stalin emerged as the ruler of Russia. In November, he expelled Trotsky from the party, exiled him to Siberia, then deported him from the Soviet Union altogether. Trotsky eventually settled in Mexico, where he continued to write against Stalin. Though half a world away, Stalin could not let go of his paranoia toward his old adversary. Time did not quell his fears, and in 1940, he commissioned an assassin who found Trotsky and drove a pickaxe through his head, silencing him forever. Stalin was obsessed with the need for industrialization. This demanded huge surpluses of food to fuel the increasing workforce and pay for imported machinery. But at the same time, wealthy peasants called kulaks were stockpiling their grain, holding out for higher prices, and so causing extreme food shortages. Stalin's solution was to force peasants to give up their individual small plots in favor of larger collective ones. These farms had the potential to be run much more efficiently. The kulaks were bitterly opposed to collectivization. Many burnt their grain and killed their animals to avoid handing them over to the government. In response, Stalin decided to liquidate the kulaks as a social class. Posters proclaimed the kulaks as the enemy of the peasants, and millions were shot, starved to death, or exiled to Siberia. This open brutality intimidated the rest of the peasants, and by 1936, 94% of land was under collective agriculture. But overall, Stalin's policy failed. Food production plummeted as the best farmers, the kulaks, along with their crops and livestock, had been destroyed. The resulting famine was devastating. Stalin's priority was exporting food to finance his industrial dream. And in 1932, he sent 5 million tons of wheat overseas, while in the Ukraine, 5 million Russians died of starvation.
We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it, or they crush us.
Stalin's vision for an industrialized Russia was based on 5-year plans. The first 5-year plan focused on heavy industry. Output increased dramatically, and worker numbers rose from 11 million to 23 million. While the rest of the world was experiencing the Great Depression, in Russia there was no unemployment. Everyone had a job. But these gains came at a great cost. Millions migrated to the cities where life was harsh. Families crammed together in one-room shacks near factories and worked under appalling conditions. The second 5-year plan was meant to give people consumer goods, but the shadowing threat of war with Germany kept the focus on bullets and war machines. To increase productivity, a propaganda campaign glorified high achievers. Failure to reach targets was punished. In 1935, a coal miner, Alexei Stakhanov, dug 14 times the normal amount of coal in a single shift and became a national hero. Achievers were now referred to as Stakhanovites and rewarded with higher pay and better housing. Output rose once again, but these figures are suspect as many factory managers falsified records to avoid punishment. Under Stalin's totalitarian regime, the government dictated what people read, heard, and were taught. Stalin's ideology was forced upon the Russian people and became the social norm. Stalin was deeply opposed to religion, particularly Christianity. All teaching of religion was banned, and many priests and nuns were arrested. In 1929, the government abolished Sunday as the day of rest. The working week was now 7 days. Women were regarded as equal to men, and the workforce swelled as women entered all professions, from the factory floor to political offices. Stalin saw education as the key to the nation's progress, so all children received basic schooling, and by 1939, over 85% of people could read and write. Communist beliefs were taught as right, capitalism evil. Books were rewritten and photographs altered to eradicate the memories of those who had fallen foul of Stalin. Music, writing, and art were also censored or adapted to reflect a positive picture of communism. Criticism was neither encouraged nor tolerated. Stalin's private life was not a happy one. Beaten as a child, he grew up to care little for his own wife and children. Stalin's appearance also a sore point. His face was badly pockmarked and one arm was shorter than the other. These realities were not acceptable to Stalin, and he unleashed a propaganda campaign to rewrite his life and Russia's history. Photos were retouched to hide his flaws, and paintings portrayed Stalin as a national hero and father figure devoted to his people. Artists and writers from around the country lavished praise upon Stalin, attributing to him all Soviet achievement. This campaign developed into a personality cult. Russians now saw Stalin and their own history exactly as he wanted them to. Stalin was acutely paranoid. Everywhere and in everything he saw enemies, double dealers, and spies. He often wore a bulletproof vest and rode in a bulletproof car. Car routes and railway stations were cleared whenever he traveled. But Stalin saved his most paranoid suspicions for those closest to him. Sergei Kirov, the leader of the Leningrad Soviet, was devoted to the Communist Party. But over time, he began to voice grave concerns about Stalin's brutality. On 1st December 1934, Kirov was shot and killed under Stalin's orders. This event marked the start of a period known as the Great Terror, where Stalin purged the country of any opponents. Secret police were everywhere, digging out suspected antagonists. Those arrested were tortured, executed, or exiled to Siberia. The Great Terror peaked from 1936 to 1938. A series of show trials were held for prominent enemies of the state suspected of opposing Stalin. The first of these was the trial of the 16 in 1936 and accused his old allies Zinoviev and Kamenev. The public prosecutor was Andrei Vyashinsky. Evidence was fabricated and victims were tortured to gain false confessions. One group were even accused of plotting with Trotsky in a hotel that records show had been closed for years. The Community Party itself was a primary target of the purges. Of Lenin's original Central Committee, only one survived: Stalin. The Red Army was also torn apart. 77 of its 88 senior commanders were executed, and half the entire officer corps, along with their wives and children, were shot or imprisoned. This created a staggering void in the military's top command, leaving Russia highly vulnerable. Eight million people slaved away in the gulags, where the annual death rate was 20%. Life here was appalling. Inmates had to work and sleep outside in the Siberian winter and were fed only scraps of food.
At the end of the workday, there were corpses left on the worksite. One of them was hunched over beneath a wheelbarrow. He had his hands in his sleeves and froze to death in that position. Two were frozen back to back, leaning against each other.
Ordinary citizens were encouraged to denounce each other, and by 1938, 1 person in every 20 had been arrested. Stalin even had the law altered to allow the execution of children as young as 12. All Russians were living in a state of terror. No one knew who it was safe to talk to. Even the secret police were spying on the secret police. Eventually, after executing hundreds of thousands of Russians, most of Stalin's opponents were dead or imprisoned. In 1939, he called a halt to the purges. When the Nazis came into power in 1933, the rest of the world was on alert. Stalin became preoccupied with the threat of invasion by Germany and sought an alliance with the West. But Britain and France were too slow in negotiating with the communists. This left Stalin with one choice to protect Russia's borders: negotiating with Hitler. On the 23rd of August, 1939, Germany and Russia signed a non-aggressive pact and an alliance to divide Poland. This relationship between the fascists and the communists was full of distrust. Stalin was mainly trying to buy time to rebuild his army. But on the 22nd of June, 1941, Hitler betrayed the agreement and launched an attack on Russia, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. This led to an all-out battle between the nations, which Russians called the Great Patriotic War. Millions were to die on each side before the war ended. Stalin was a determined and visionary leader, but he was also completely ruthless. Under his totalitarian regime, Russia's industry prospered, and the general quality of life improved for many people. But these gains did not come without sacrifice. Russian people lived in perpetual fear of persecution. Stalin controlled everything from where they worked to what they were taught. Millions were exiled or executed. Lingering questions now remain of how we interpret Stalin's reign. Was he a ruthless mass murderer who cared little for his country or people? Or a determined dictator who forced Russia into the modern world for its own good? In other words, did his ends justify his means?